Good evening. Definitely want to welcome all of our pastors and ministers back to our forum. And I am so excited about sharing with you this evening. Really enjoyed our interaction on yesterday and looking forward to all God has for us on this day. As I was thinking about last night's session, the pastor as preacher, that has been affirmed in so many ways. I remember hearing a sermon when I was a seminary student at Southern Baptist Seminary. The pastor then, Riverside Church in Brooklyn, New York, Dr. James Forbes, preached. And his sermon was from Exodus chapter 3 and 4. And the subject was, "Let my preachers go." And I always have been helpfully haunted by that, because the premise was that in order for God's people to experience renewal and reinvigoration spiritually, something has to happen with God's preachers. And so I hope last night accentuated that and encouraged your ministry in terms of how primary the gift of pastor teacher is, and also how primary preaching is in the life of the church. So we're looking forward to what we're going to do this evening. We're looking at the second component of what we're sharing during this Congress, and that is the pastor as leader. The pastor as leader. Last night, the pastor as preacher. Tonight, we're going to focus on the pastor as leader. And three areas that I'm going to cover is our stewardship, our being servants, and our being strategists. So the pastor as servant, the pastor as steward, and the pastor as strategist. When I think about leadership, one of the passages in the Bible that is so influential and impactful in my perspectives about leadership is Joshua chapter 1. It's such a signature precedent-setting passage, and sometimes between tonight and tomorrow, I hope you would read the entire first chapter of Joshua. But tonight, and you have it in your notes, I want to read verse 1 of chapter 1 of Joshua. It says, "Now after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spake unto Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' minister, saying." And if you read the rest of that passage, if you read particularly down to verse 10, there are just so many nuggets in that passage that has to do with leadership and what we will talk about and share on this evening. Just a summary of them. All of them begin with M. It's just kind of the way I process things. But that passage in its entirety and in its context deals with the mortality of the leader. It deals with the motivation of the leader. It deals with the mandate of the leader. It deals with the mentality of the leader. It deals with the meditation of the leader. And it deals with the multiplication of the leader in terms of how we extend ourselves, how we extend our influence into the lives of other people and those who come alongside of us in ministry. And so I want you to look at that passage, and as you think about those M's I just shared, and they are in your notes with a reference to the verses that I think are applicable to each of them, I want to share just some introductory reflections around leadership before we get into the heart of our session tonight. First of all, when I think about leadership, when I define it, when I describe it, leadership is influence. It's nothing more and it's nothing less. It's influence. And because it's influence, we all are leaders. The only question is, are we good leaders or are we bad leaders? And that can be applicable not only in the life of the church, it's true in the home, in marriage, it's true in business, it's true in civic work. We're all leaders in some capacity, because of our influence. But the question is our influence positive or is our influence negative? Another thing I think about when I think about leadership is that if you are leading and no one is following, you're just taking a walk. So the whole focus around leadership is to encourage people to join us in whatever purpose or objective that we're involved with. I heard the story years ago when a pastor's conference preacher was sharing about how a pastor, new pastor in his church, would often say to the congregants and to the leaders that I'm the pastor and I'm called to lead and to feed, to lead and to feed. And then after a few weeks of that, hearing that being repeated, one of the older leaders asked the pastor, said, if your job is to lead and feed, what is our job? And the pastor said, your job is to follow and swallow. So I always think about that when I think about leadership. The pastor's leadership, and I shared with you in session 1 that I wrote my most recent book, Riding the Wave, leading the church from message to mission with local churches and pastors in mind, sharing the experiences of almost 4 decades of my own pastoral leadership experience. These principles and perspectives and priorities and paradigms are codified in this book, and I hope you've got a copy or would get a copy. It is available on Amazon in a Kindle and hard print edition, or you can order it directly from me. But I would love for you to look into that material and the resources that I've shared that I hope will help you in your own ministry. But there's a quote in Riding the Wave where it says the pastor's leadership, when proactively and courageously inclusive, will greatly encourage and expedite the process of renewal and revitalization in the congregation. It will encourage and expedite the process of renewal and revitalization in the congregation. No role, no position in the local church is more primary and pivotal in that dynamic than the role of the pastor. We've been called to great responsibility. The other thing I want to say in terms of just general reflections about leadership or pastors' leadership is I think of Thomas Carlyle, who wrote a few years ago about the history of the world is the biography of great men. History is shaped by heroes through the vision of their intellect, the beauty of their art, the proudness of their leadership, and divine inspiration. And so I'm always intrigued by any study or discussion of leadership because I am just so amazed. I'm so moved by how one person, a leader, one person in a group, that person's influence and that person's engagement can make such a difference. And what Carlyle was saying, and you know it to be true, we could think about some of the great personages of history, Alexander the Great, Winston Churchill, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, and that would apply. I remember visiting Robben Island during my first trip to South Africa, and just looking at that small cell that he was incarcerated in for all those years, over 20 years, and how from that small cell and from that island, shut off from the rest of the world, literally, he could move a nation. He could move a nation. And so the importance, again, of leadership in any realm, but particularly in the life of the church. Your role, pastors, is so very, very critical. The other thing that I think about is one of the persons who've influenced me greatly in terms of how I view leadership is Dr. John Maxwell. Dr. John Maxwell served as a pastor for a number of years and then began to just be a motivational speaker, developer, or mentor of leaders. And he's written so much on the subject. But one of the books that he wrote, The 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, he talks about the law of the lid. And I quote it in my book, Riding the Wave. But John's position, Dr. Maxwell's position, is that no organization, no entity, no nothing will ever rise higher than the lid of its leader. So again, I'm just emphasizing to you how important your role is as leaders in the life of the church. Yes, you preach on Sunday, but your leadership creates that environment and that context where people in a non-chaotic environment can hear and appreciate what you have to say. So let's get into the heart of what we're going to do tonight as we talk about the pastor's leader. Again, we're servants, we're stewards, and we're strategists. So let's talk about servant. But in Joshua chapter 1, verse 1, I want to read that again. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, or it could be translated servant, saying. It's interesting to me that in this one verse in Joshua chapter 1, the word servant occurs at the beginning of the verse and at the end of the verse. The first instance in relationship to Moses, and in the second instance in relationship to Joshua. And I think that's significant because when we look at the entire Word of God, I just want to share this with you. The word leader occurs 3 times in the Bible, but the word servant occurs 498 times. Leader, 3 times. The word servant, 498 times. And what does this say to us about the fundamental perspective and paradigm of leadership in the Word of God? It says this, that we are servants. And so for years as pastor, when I shared with leaders, I always appendaged my reference to them as leaders by making sure that servant was attached to it. So we identified the leaders in the churches I served as servant leaders that embraced everyone or encompassed everyone from the pastor to the person who led the children ministry, because we're at our best when we are serving. I love the account in John chapter 2, the first miracle that Jesus performs in his public ministry according to John. He turns water into wine. And you know the story, preachers, ministers, pastors, you know the story, how he transformed water into perhaps the best wine or the best wine the world has ever known. But that passage is significant for me because while the person, the governor of the wedding feast, didn't know where the wine come from, the couple who had planned this event, this affair, did not know where the wine come from because the wine had run out. The Bible says, and it's in parentheses, but I love it, it says the servants knew where the wine, the ones who at Jesus' command had poured water that had probably been set aside for some ritual purpose, poured it out so it was transformed by his touch into wine. They knew where the wine came from. And so the servant, or the one who has a servant mentality, we have a perspective and an insight that I don't believe that others have who are not as committed to this. And so we are servant leaders. Another way of thinking about it is that our leadership is at its best. Listen to me. Our leadership is at its best when we're adding value to the lives of other people. That's true in a marriage. That's true in parenting. That's true in the life of the church. That's true in any realm, when we put the needs of others above ourselves, and our commitment primarily is to add value to them, then our presence, our engagement, our gifts can be very influential and very impactful. This pandemic has created such dysfunction and division, and I am being intentional, even in the most ordinary settings. My engagement with the clerk at the grocery store, or just any number of situations. I'm always thinking about how, as people experiencing all the stress and strain of this season, how I can add value. Sometimes it's just opening a door for someone, who has things in their hands. But how can you add value to life of other people? And if we have that mentality in the church, I think our churches would be much, much stronger as we think about strengthening the ministry of the local church. Cinematic history speaks to us sometimes about things that are spiritual. I remember the 1987 movie, The Untouchables. Kevin Costner, Sean Connery played in it. Sean Connery played a beat cop that became a member of the Untouchable Squad that the federal government put in place in Chicago to curb the sale of illegal alcohol. And then Kevin Costner, he played Elliot Ness, and he was the head of that squad, the Untouchables. That's how they became known. But there is a scene where Connery, who plays the beat cop that was recruited to this squad, and Ness, they're in the chapel, and they've had a raid on Al Capone, who is the titular head of crime in Chicago. There's this scene in a chapel, and they're on their knees because both of these men are Catholic. And Connery says to Kevin Costner, those characters engage, and he says to him, everybody knows where Capone's liquor is, but they've never been willing to sacrifice or to pay the cost of getting it and raiding it. And he looks at him and he says, what are you prepared to do? And I believe when I think about that, I believe when we think of ministry and our role as pastors, our role as ministers, our role in relationship to other people, what are we prepared to do? What are we prepared to do? Because with a servant mentality also comes sacrifice. Jesus said it in Mark chapter 10, verses 45 of himself. He says, I did not come to be served, but to serve and give my life a ransom for many. So what are you prepared to do? Because when we have a servant mentality, when we try to live out this idea of being servants, then it will cost us something. In Riding the Wave on page 42, I write this: unprincipled entitlement and unchecked egotism are pernicious piranhas that will marginalize, minimize, and maroon a church or ministry in mediocrity. So the pastor as leader, we have to look at that role as servant first. That's key. That's key. We are servants. And so Joshua chapter 1, verse 1, remember, it's bookend with this idea of servants. They were not identified as presidents or prime ministers or CEOs. They were identified, Moses and Joshua, as servants. Here's the second thing, the pastor as steward. The pastor as steward. Stewardship in the Word of God is not simplistic. It's very comprehensive. So often when we mention stewardship in our churches, people immediately go to the dollar bill. They go to the offering tray. But over the years, I have come to appreciate that stewardship biblically is very holistic. It covers a great deal of spiritual, experiential terrain. It involves our treasure, all that we possess. It involves our tithe. When you look at it that way, God's not just concerned about the 10% that belongs to Him, that He owns, but the 90% He allows us to use as well. It involves our temple, which is our body. I understand one of the classes in this Congress, it has to do with fitness and diet. That's so timely. It has to do with our time. We all get 24 hours a day, but how do we use it? Do we use it to make a difference? Do we use it to the glory of God? It involves our talent. We all have been blessed with a gift. And over the years, I have moved even beyond those 5 areas to 2 more. It involves our test, because sooner or later in life, we're going to be tested. Sometimes God tests us in order to temper us so that we might grow stronger in our faith. So when we're tested, when that inevitable storm takes place, how do we handle it? And out of that test, here's something else we're responsible for, and that's number 7, is our testimony. So when we're tested and we come through the storm, there ought to be a testimony. And somebody said it this way, we've heard it often, when blessings come down, praises ought to go up. And so stewardship, as we think about the pastor's role as steward, is a very comprehensive area. It involves, again, treasure, tithe, time, temple, talent, test, and testimony. A few years ago, I was attending a graduate seminar at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Chicago, where I was working on my doctoral degree. And while I was there that week, I discovered, really, the poem discovered me. A poem by a Spanish poet named Antonio Machado. It's in your notes, but he ends the poem, talks about the wind one brilliant day called to my soul with an odor of jasmine. In return for the odor of my jasmine, I like all the odor of your roses. It's very elegant, eloquent, but he ends with a question. What have you done with the garden that was entrusted to you? Oh man, that haunted me the first time I encountered it, because I was in the throes of the ministry of serving my first congregation, the first congregation God called me to. But it helpfully haunted me and still does. What have you done with the garden that was entrusted to you? We are called to be stewards of what God blesses us with. And all the blessings we have, all things we used to sing during offertory at First Baptist Church of Chesterfield, all things come of thee, O Lord, and of thine own have we given thee. And so whatever we have, pastors, whatever we have, it comes from God. We can't make it. We can't resurrect it. It comes from God. In that context, as I think about the stewardship of the pastor, there's a passage in 2 Timothy chapter 2 that has encouraged my ministry, my perspective around pastoral ministry, and this aspect of it for years. It's 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1. It's in your notes. Thou therefore, my son, Paul writes to Timothy, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. And the things, listen to this, and the things that thou hast heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men who shall be able to teach others also. Faithful men are by implication women who shall be able to teach others also. In your notes, you have the Message paraphrase of that passage. I like the way Eugene Peterson, who writes with a pastor's heart, comes at it. This gets to the heart of our role as stewards. And when I think of it in two terms or in two categories. First of all, stewardship and transmission of the ministry. Stewardship and transmission of the ministry, and then stewardship and transition of the ministry. I remember hearing a quote from the founder of the Franciscan order of monks in the monastic tradition of the Catholic Church, Francis of Assisi, as other monks gathered around him and they became an order. I remember a quote where he shared with them as he mentored them, as he gave them leadership and guidance. He says, as you go, he looked at them, he says, as you go, preach. And then he said this, and if you must, speak. I thought that was awesome because it lets me know that what we do speaks much louder than what we say. It goes to that approach in classic theory of rhetoric. Aristotle, Greek philosophers and others who came up with an approach where they looked at communication comprehensively and thought of it in this way. There are three aspects of it. Classical rhetoricians, they approached it this way. There are three aspects of it. There is ethos, that's the character of the communicator. There is pathos, that's the compassion of the communicator. And there's logos, which is the content of the communicator. And so sometimes people can't get to the content that we're trying to share because they don't see the character, they don't see the compassion. You know, I shared this in the book. When I went to my first church, I've had the privilege of serving two historic congregations, 20th pastor in each congregation, both churches founded by slaves. This year, my first church, First Baptist Georgetown, will be 179 years old. My most recent assignment, where I served, First Baptist Church of Chesterfield, will be celebrating 175 years. I remember being called to my first church and getting there, and the church had gone through a difficult season, exacerbated by the interim period. There was much that needed to be done, particularly in terms of facility upkeep and repairs. And I remember some of those early projects, pouring sidewalks, repairing porches, painting, drywalling. I was right there with the men doing those projects. And in retrospect, while I did not do it with that in mind, I just did it because that's the way I'm wired. That's kind of the work ethic that I developed or was encouraged in me when I was growing up on the farm in Tennessee. But I did not know how impactful my getting into the mix with them would be to my leadership and their response to my leadership as pastor. And so that gave new meaning to my whole perspective around incarnational ministry. We can't be afraid of getting dirty. And it's kind of like what God told Ezekiel in Ezekiel, I believe chapter 37. He sat where the people sat. And so there is this impact that we make that enables the transmission of the ministry. It's one way we share it. It's one way we convey it. It's one way we pass it on when we engage other people in the space where they are. I remember attending a banquet years ago, and a banner over the dais. I don't remember much of anything else that happened, but there was a banner over the dais. This was a nonprofit organization that raised scholarship for young people in the community. And I attended an event they sponsored to raise funds, and the banner said, "As you climb, lift." I can't tell you what the speaker said, what anybody else said that evening, but over 40 years ago, that banquet banner still resonates in my spirit because it goes back to what I said earlier. It's how we add value, that intentionality, that desire to serve others. As you climb, live. Pastors, I think all of us should be engaged in 3 primary relationships. We should have a Paul that challenges us. We should have a Barnabas that comes alongside of us and holds up our arms. And we should have a Timothy that we're sharing with and pulling along with us as God blesses us. So we're stewards. And that stewardship translates into the transmission of the ministry. Let me put it this way, it's how we become infectious and pass along what God has infected us with. Here's another way of thinking about stewardship is not only stewardship as the transmission of ministry, stewardship and transmission of ministry, but stewardship and transition of the ministry. That passage that I read to you, you read with me in Joshua chapter 1. In that same first verse, it says, Moses, the servant of the Lord, he died. None of us will live forever. Life at its fundamental base is precarious. We don't know what a day will bring forth. And so there has to be in ministry not only a mindset around how we transmit this ministry into the hearts and lives of those that God has called us to serve, but there also has to be some intentionality around how we transition the ministry. I always believe that the true test and validation of our leadership is what happens when we are absent or no longer there. I think it can be said of marriage, it can be said of parenting, it can be said of employer-employee relationships. If people are only committed to the ministry or to the organization or to the values of the organization, when we're present, then somehow we've dropped the ball. We've missed a circuit. And so there has to be some thought and some intentionality around how do we transition. I often told the leaders at my churches, the churches God called me to serve, they were his churches, I was just a servant. I often told the leaders that our leadership could not be person-centric. It had to be God-centric or Bible-centric. In other words, the focus can't be on the person. It has to be on God and His Word. Because that assures in ministry sustainability. That assures that when you're no longer... You get the sense when you read about the interaction and relationship between Joshua and Moses, that there was an intentionality. There was, particularly on Moses' part, a recognition that even though he had a special relationship with God, even though the Bible says of him that he had that relationship, Moses never thought he would live forever. And his heart for the people, his servant mindset for the people motivated him to assure that in his absence, someone else would be able to sustain the ministry and fulfill the vision that God has for his people. As stewards, and my professor in seminary, Dr. Warren Wiersbe, great preacher and pastor, he would challenge us in our class. He would say that ministers, pastors, finish well. He said, finish well. And that goes to this whole idea of transitioning. I'm so encouraged now, almost a year and a half removed from my retirement as a pastor and entering this new season of ministry, I'm so encouraged by the reports I hear over and over again of how well the ministry that I'm no longer physically present in is doing. And I have to say to you, and I address some of this in my book in terms of how we approach that challenge, but I have to say to you that that gives me so much joy at this season of my ministry, is that not only did I try to be a steward in terms of how the ministry and its vision was transmitted, but also how we transitioned when I was no longer there. So the pastor's leader, I hope you see these pieces as servant, as a steward. Let me just spend a little time talking about the pastor as a strategist. I said in the first session that we're dietitians. In relationship to the Word of God and our preaching, we're dietitians. We prepare the diet as God's Spirit leads us, that blesses God's people, that strengthens God's people. And we don't want to give them junk food. we don't want to give them a diet high in sugar content. We want to make sure there's some fiber and some vegetables. I think you get the metaphor. But we're also diagnosticians. We diagnose. We engage the ministry with a servant and steward mentality, and we diagnose the climate. We diagnose the culture. We are intentional about deepening our understanding of the unique DNA, divinely nurtured attributes of the congregation that we are called to serve, and more particularly the leaders who come alongside of us. When I was called to my most recent post over 20 years ago, I spent the first 6 months engaging in a process as I interacted with the leaders of the various ministries of the church, of trying to understand them and understand the culture of the church that God had called me to. There has to be congregational IQ, cultural competence, as we think of our role as strategists. We have to diagnose before we prescribe. That first 6 months of my ministry of First Baptist Church Chesterfield, I made no major decisions because I wanted to get some sense of the pulse, the heartbeat of the congregation. And I felt one of the ways to do that is to engage the leaders and hear them talk about what they felt were the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats to the ministry. And what happened over a period of 6 months, and I kept these journals, these records for 20 years. I still have them in my files because they were so valuable, is that themes began to emerge. Trends began to emerge that helped me as pastor to better engage the congregation and move us or lead us from message to mission. We have to be strategists. Let me put it this way. I learned years ago that managers do things right, but leaders do the right things. Sometimes you can do something right, but it's not the right thing to do. So there has to be a sense of timing. I think all pastors should be required to listen at least once to the great theologian who wrote these words. You got to know when to hold them. You got to know when to fold them. You got to know when to walk away. And you got to know when to run. As strategists, there has to be a sense of timing. Sometimes you want to perform a spiritual procedure or operation, and the patient is not healthy enough for the procedure, and they die on the operating table. So there has to be a timing factor. Every hill, when you're dealing with conflict management from a strategic standpoint, every hill is not worthy of a crucifixion. Every hill is not worthy of a crucifixion. Pick your battles. And there are battles that you'll have to fight. I used to tell our leaders, particularly our deacons, I would say we're called to be peacemakers, but sometimes the price of peace is too high. That's true in church life, that's true in marriage, that's true in family, our relationship with our kids. Sometimes the need to get along and go along, the price is much, much too high. And so there has to be a sense and intentionality, a strategic thought process that is an integral part of our role as pastors in the local church. I wish it was just preaching on Sunday, but all the other things that we do, particularly in leadership, that creates a context, creates an environment that minimizes chaos and diminishes disorder and creates the climate where people on Sunday or Wednesday, because the background noise has been reduced, can hear what thus saith the Lord. And pastors, we can't forfeit or forsake that role. We can't always delegate it. We have to be the person, be the one who establishes that lid. At a point in time, yes, we can commit that vision, we can commit that mission, we can commit that objective to others, but we can't be on the sidelines. We have to set the tone. We do it through our example. We do it by adding value to the lives of others. We do it by lifting as we climb. And when we do it, and our intent and motivation is for God to get the glory, then God will bless us. I just tonight whetted your appetite. I could spend a lot of sessions talking about this, but this is enough for us on this evening as we wrap this up. Pastor as servant, or the pastor's leader, pastor's a servant, the pastor is a steward, and the pastor is a strategist. So that, coupled with what we did in session one, gives us two pieces of the three roles that I think, when interfaced in the life of the local church through the gift of pastor-teacher, will strengthen the ministry and advance the kingdom of God. May the Lord bless you, may keep you. I look forward to interacting with you during our question and answer period.